After 9 hours of painful labor, her husband and his mom said, "You're dead to us," until a CEO doctor walked in and stunned everyone. Warm welcome to Beyond Color Stories. I'm your storyteller, James. I hope you're doing well today. Tell me, where in the world are you listening to me from? I love knowing how far our stories reach. And hey, I've noticed something. Many of you are watching but still haven't joined James's family. So please just hit that subscribe button and become a part of this beautiful, growing family of love, strength, and storytelling. Trust me, today's story is not one to miss. It's emotional, powerful, and will touch your heart in ways you didn't expect. So don't skip a second. Stay with me till the very end. Now, let's dive into the story. Shania had always believed in love, not the kind shown in fairy tales or movies, but the kind that grows slowly, tenderly, the kind that blooms in quiet sacrifices and soft-spoken words. With her smooth brown skin, her graceful walk, her radiant yet humble smile, she carried within her a beauty that went deeper than appearances. She grew up learning that love should be unconditional, that hearts are seen through actions, not appearances. But when she married Karen, the man she had once thought could give her that kind of love, she stepped unknowingly into a world that would test every belief she held about what love meant and what cruelty could truly look like behind closed doors. Her wedding day had been small but full of hope. Her soft eyes filled with dreams, her hands shaking as she wore the ivory dress her mother had carefully saved up for, the kind that hugged her softly and made her feel seen, if only for a fleeting moment. But even on that day, the hints were there. Karen's mother, a sharply dressed woman with lips permanently curved in disdain, had barely looked her in the eyes. Her gaze scanned Shanae's dress with a sneer, her handshake limp and cold, as if touching Shanae's skin would infect her with something unworthy. "Is this really the best you could do?" she had whispered to her son when she thought no one was listening. But Shanae had heard, and Karen said nothing. That silence, that first betrayal, was the seed of 1,000 future wounds. Still, Shanae had smiled. She had promised herself that love, patience, and time could soften even the hardest hearts. But it didn't take long after the wedding for the truth to settle in. She was not the daughter-in-law they wanted, and her presence was treated like a blemish on their perfect family picture. From the moment she stepped into their house, the air felt colder. The walls, grand and painted in pale ivory, echoed with unspoken tension. Karen's mother, Margaret, made sure her disdain was felt in every glance, every unfinished sentence, every disapproving sigh that lingered in the room like a ghost. "You could at least wear something lighter," she'd mutter, pretending to be helpful. "Dark skin needs softer colors, or you'll just look dull." Shanae would nod silently, not because she agreed, but because speaking up only invited sharper cruelty. She had walked into the marriage with dreams of being a daughter, a wife, and maybe one day a mother. But each morning she woke up feeling more like a trespasser in her own life. Karen was no savior. He was neither violent nor loud, but perhaps that made it worse. He didn't throw insults the way his mother did. Instead, he let them float in the air, untreated, unresolved. He was indifferent. Shanae would cook a warm dinner, his favorites remembered with care, only to have him scroll through his phone silently, eat without thanks, and leave the table, as if her effort was invisible. He rarely asked how she was. He never complimented her, never reached for her hand the way he had during their short courtship. It was as if, once the ring was on her finger, his interest vanished like mist in the morning sun. And yet Shani, still hopeful, tried. She filled the home with little things, flowers in the hallway, soft music in the evenings, candles during dinner. She dressed modestly yet elegantly, wore her hair in soft twists that framed her face beautifully. But nothing was enough. Margaret would scoff. "You think this is a 5-star resort? We don't need your decorations. And Karen would say nothing, his silence a sword that cut deeper than words. Shanae's presence became a trigger, not a blessing. Even when she simply sat in the living room, reading a book quietly, Margaret would find a way to criticize. "Shouldn't you be doing something useful?" she'd hiss. "People like you don't get to relax." The phrase, "people like you," rang in Shanae's ears like a curse. It was always there, hidden beneath their words, the rejection of her skin, her background, her essence. Margaret once told her, with a wineglass in hand and false sweetness, "You'd be pretty if you were a little lighter. It's just unfortunate." And Karen, who was present for this humiliating moment, simply changed the subject, as if pretending it didn't happen would erase the sting. Shanae cried in the bathroom that night, her back pressed against the cold tiles, her sobs muffled by the sound of running water. She had never felt so small, so unlovable. But she didn't give up. She told herself that maybe they were just adjusting, that maybe her love could prove her worth. She made breakfast every morning. Karen liked eggs with hot sauce. Margaret preferred tea with 2 sugars and just a splash of milk. Shanae remembered every detail. She cleaned the house until the windows shined, folded laundry with precision, and stayed quiet during arguments, always fearing that speaking up would make things worse. Her silence was not weakness, it was survival. And yet, despite everything, she clung to the hope that love might bloom, even in such poisoned soil. At family gatherings, she was treated like a ghost. Karen's relatives would greet Margaret with warmth and Karen with pride, but Shanae only received tight smiles and polite nods. No one asked how she was adjusting, no one cared about her dreams, her job, or her life before marriage. She was just his wife, nothing more, and often much less. Once, when a cousin asked her where she was from, and she answered with honesty and pride about her childhood, Margaret interrupted with a chuckle and said, "Oh, she's from the other side of town." Not the best part, of course. Laughter followed. Shanae laughed too, quietly, but the pain stuck in her throat like a thorn. She often found herself standing by the kitchen window at night, staring out into the garden, searching for stars that might carry her silent prayers. She missed her old life, not because it was perfect, but because at least it was honest. At least there she was loved. Her mother had taught her how to braid her hair with care, how to speak with grace, how to walk like a woman who knew her worth. Her father used to call her his queen, and always reminded her that her skin was a crown, not a curse. In this house, though, she felt like a prisoner in silk, beautiful but unseen, alive but never embraced. One evening, as she brought tea into the living room, she overheard Margaret whispering to Karen, "You need to fix this mistake. She's ruining our image. What will people think?" Karen sighed and said nothing. Shanae stood in the hallway, her heart aching. She didn't cry. She just turned, walked to her room, and sat in silence. That night she held her hands together and whispered, "God, am I really that unwanted?" The walls didn't answer. The ceiling didn't comfort her. And the man lying beside her turned his back and fell asleep. Her days continued like a routine wrapped in sorrow. Every morning was the same. Wake up, smile, serve, stay silent. Every night was a quiet ache. She tried writing in a journal, tried praying more, tried reading books that promised healing. But healing doesn't happen when the wound is daily reopened. Still, she remained kind. She greeted Margaret with politeness, complimented Karen's shirts, offered tea when no one asked. Not because she was weak, but because it was her nature. Kindness wasn't her strategy. It was her truth. She was made of gentleness, of courage wrapped in softness. One day she found an old photo of herself in a box. She was smiling, her eyes glowing, her skin kissed by sunlight. She barely recognized the girl in the photo. That girl was free, full of hope. She held the photo close as if it could remind her who she truly was beneath the layers of pain. She wanted to be that woman again, the one who laughed with her whole body, who believed she was enough, just as she was. But the house she lived in didn't leave room for such dreams. It was a place that expected silence and submission, and even when she gave both, it still wasn't enough. The day she told Karen she was pregnant, she thought maybe, just maybe, things would change. That night she wore his favorite dress, cooked his favorite meal, and placed a tiny note under his plate that read, "We're going to be parents." He read it without emotion. "Okay," was all he said. No joy, no kiss, no warmth. She forced a smile, blinking back tears. Later that night, she told Margaret, hoping for a different response. "Well," she said, sipping her tea, "let's hope the baby looks like Karen's side of the family." Shanae's heart shattered again, but she kept going. For the life inside her, for the girl she once was, for the hope that refused to die completely. She was unwanted in that house, treated like a burden, insulted for her skin, her softness, her silence. And yet, she remained kind. That was Shanae, the girl they never wanted, but the woman whose spirit refused to break. Shanae rose early every morning, even though her body begged for rest and her soul pleaded for a moment of peace that never came. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, heavy, and filled with invisible expectations that wrapped around her throat like chains. Each step she took on the cold marble floor of that mansion echoed not with pride or belonging, but with a quiet reminder. She did not belong here. Her every movement was watched, her every word weighed. It wasn't just Margaret's sharp tongue that struck her anymore. It was Karen's lack of presence, his complete emotional absence that carved the deepest wounds. Shanae had once believed love would arrive after marriage, that maybe kindness would build like slow-burning fire. But in that house, marriage was not a beginning. It was an elegant prison sentence without a key. Karen no longer looked at her the way he had once looked across the cafe table where they first met. He didn't meet her eyes, didn't ask her how she felt, didn't offer his arms when she felt dizzy carrying his child. There were no soft hands on her growing belly, no tender questions about baby names, no warm moments in bed at night. His touch had disappeared the moment she took his last name, and now his words only came in commands, cold, curt, and delivered with eyes still glued to his phone or laptop. And when his voice wasn't present, his mother's was. Margaret filled the home with venom disguised as tradition, control cloaked in the name of family legacy. She watched Shanae like a hawk circling prey, ready to strike over the smallest imperfection. "You put too much salt in the soup again. No wonder Karen doesn't come home for lunch," she snapped one afternoon, slamming her silver spoon down like a judge delivering a cruel verdict. Shanae bit her lip, carrying the tray back into the kitchen, the weight of that single comment heavier than the porcelain bowl. She whispered to herself not to cry, that it wasn't worth it, but the sting still burned. Some days Margaret would come into her room without knocking, open her drawers, criticize her clothes, her hair oils, her skincare products, her very scent. "You always smell too rich. Use something light, modest." Shanae couldn't even wear the fragrance her mother once gifted her on her wedding day without being accused of trying too hard. She felt like a stranger renting space in her own marriage, a guest overstaying her welcome in a place where she had been promised forever. As her belly grew, the only comfort she had was placing her hands gently over the curve, whispering lullabies and soft dreams into the silence. "You're coming into a world that may not be ready for you," she told her unborn child one night, brushing her fingers over the spot where she'd just felt a tiny kick. "But I will be here. I will love you the way no one ever loved me." And she meant it. Her tears weren't just for her pain anymore. They were for the life inside her that deserved something better, something brighter. The house around her had more chandeliers than warmth, more marble than mercy. It gleamed with wealth, but lacked love. She cleaned every inch of it, scrubbing away Margaret's constant inspections, even though pregnancy left her sore, lightheaded, and often nauseated. But complaints weren't allowed in that home. Weakness was a flaw to be ridiculed, not soothed. Karen didn't even accompany her to the clinic appointments. He always had meetings, always had excuses. She sat in the waiting room among smiling couples, watching husbands hold their wives' hands, press kisses to their foreheads after hearing their baby's heartbeat. Shanae sat alone. She took videos of the monitor and sent them to Karen. He never replied. Once, she asked him if he wanted to feel the baby move. He glanced up from his laptop, placed a distracted hand on her stomach for 3 seconds, then returned to his screen without a word. That night, she cried quietly into the pillow while he snored beside her, his back turned, unaware, or worse, uninterested. Margaret controlled everything: what meals were served, what furniture was moved, what guests visited. When Shanae tried to speak up once, only once, about wanting to decorate the nursery with soft colors and animal prints, she was shut down instantly. "You'll do what I tell you. That child is my legacy. I won't have jungle colors in my grandchild's room." Her words were laced with racism wrapped in fake sophistication. Shanae lowered her eyes, retreating into herself again. She realized then that even her unborn baby wasn't fully hers in this house. She was an outsider, even to the life growing within her, constantly being claimed by a woman who never saw her as human. The loneliness crawled into bed with her at night, wrapping around her growing belly like vines of sadness. She spoke to her baby because no one else would listen. "I hope you have my heart," she said softly, "but not my scars. I hope you'll be loved just for breathing, not for proving something to people who never cared." Her baby kicked in response, and it felt like a tiny affirmation. But Shanae's soul was crumbling. Her dreams were slowly turning to dust. She began to fear the sound of footsteps in the hallway, never knowing if they brought another insult, another order, another reminder that she was not enough. When Karen brought business guests home, she was expected to serve, smile, and disappear. She wore the dresses Margaret chose, plain, pale, designed to erase her figure and draw as little attention as possible. She greeted the guests with perfect manners, served the wine exactly as instructed, and left before anyone could ask her anything personal. "She's quiet," one of the guests once remarked. Margaret laughed. "She knows her place." The laughter that followed was the sound of chains tightening around Shanae's throat. That night she sat in the bathtub long after the water had gone cold, hugging her knees, staring at the flickering candle flame, wondering when she had stopped feeling like a woman and started feeling like a shadow. She wasn't allowed to decorate, wasn't allowed to call her mother often, wasn't allowed to work. Her phone was monitored, her movements commented on. Even the books she read were mocked. "That's what you waste your time on?" Margaret once said, pulling a novel from her hand and tossing it on the floor. "Try reading something useful." Shanae picked it up silently. Her voice was her own, but it was buried deep, covered by years of being told she was too much, too dark, too different, too wrong. She had been silenced so thoroughly that now even her thoughts began to doubt themselves. And still, she cooked dinner, folding each napkin with care, setting the table with symmetry, hoping that maybe tonight something would shift. Maybe tonight Karen would smile. Maybe Margaret would say thank you. But the chairs remained cold, the food untouched, and the silence deafening. Her body ached from standing so long, from bending over dishes with a belly growing heavier each day. But no one asked if she needed help. No one offered a chair, a kind word, a moment of softness. Kindness had no place in that home. It had been evicted the day Shanae moved in. At night, when the lights were off and the only sound was the ticking of the hallway clock, Shanae would press her hand to her belly and whisper, "You are not alone. I am here. We will leave this cage someday." Her voice trembled with hope she no longer fully believed in. She was living in a gilded cage, one with silk sheets and chandeliers, but no freedom, no love, just survival. Every day felt like a performance where the reward was more pain, and yet she endured. Not because she was weak, but because she had something they couldn't take from her. Her heart, her baby, her truth. She no longer looked in mirrors. She no longer wore the lipstick she used to love. Her heels gathered dust. Her laughter had become a memory, not a sound. Even her handwriting looked unfamiliar now. Shanae, the vibrant, strong, beautiful woman who once believed in love, now walked through each day like a ghost in her own life. The house was grand, but it was never hers. The husband wore a ring, but never spoke her name with love. The mother-in-law smiled for others, but poured poison behind closed doors. And the baby inside her, the only spark of joy left, was her only reason to keep breathing. She was not living. She was existing. She was not loved. She was tolerated. She was not free. She was trapped. A prisoner in a mansion. A wife in name only. A mother-to-be fighting to stay whole in a place that tried every day to break her. The rain tapped softly on the window panes that morning, but inside Shanae's chest, a different kind of storm had begun to brew. One not of thunder or lightning, but of twisting pain that radiated through her lower back and wrapped tightly around her belly like an iron grip. It was too early for breakfast, and yet her eyes snapped open, her hand instinctively sliding over her stomach, feeling the unmistakable tension of life demanding entrance into the world. She gasped softly, lips parting, the air slicing through her as she sat up, slowly, her heart beating faster than it had the entire pregnancy. The contractions were real this time, sharp, timed, growing with intensity. She placed one foot on the floor, then the other, holding her breath as the next wave gripped her and made her knees tremble. "Karen," she whispered, her voice raspy, more from heartbreak than sleep. "Karen, I think it's time." But there was no response, just the familiar sound of his shallow breathing, his back turned toward her like a curtain pulled shut against the morning light. She steadied herself on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, sweat beginning to gather on her temples as she slowly stood. Her legs wobbled slightly under the pressure of both life and labor, but she willed herself forward, walking the cold hallway toward the bathroom. With every step, the pain grew, like unseen hands twisting her insides with each contraction, as if the child inside her was trying to break free from more than just her body. She leaned against the wall for support, whispering soft reassurances to herself. "You can do this, Shanae. You can do this." When she returned to the bedroom, Karen was still lying there, eyes open now, watching her without moving, without even lifting his head. "What?" he asked flatly, annoyance already dripping from his voice like poison. Shanae gritted her teeth through another wave of pain and said, "We need to go to the hospital. I think the baby's coming." Karen sat up slowly, sighing like he'd been asked to do something completely unreasonable. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't hold her hand. He simply reached for his phone, mumbled something about grabbing his keys, and walked past her. Shanae followed slowly, holding her belly, each breath getting harder, each second feeling heavier. By the time she reached the living room, Margaret was already dressed, sitting with her legs crossed, sipping her morning tea like it was any other day. When Karen said they needed to go to the hospital, she rolled her eyes and muttered, "Took her long enough." Then she stood up briskly, fixing her pearl earrings, and looked Shanae up and down like a worn-out rug. "Try not to embarrass us there," she snapped. "Walk properly. You look like you're about to collapse." Shanae didn't respond. She had no strength for their cruelty today. Her mind was focused on breathing, on staying upright. on reaching the hospital before her body gave out entirely. The ride to the hospital was painfully quiet. Karen drove fast as if checking an errand off his list. Margaret sat beside him, fussing over a nail that had chipped slightly, sighing dramatically. Shanae sat in the back seat, her arms wrapped around her belly, head leaning against the window as another contraction gripped her, stealing her breath. She winced in silence, biting her lip until it bled, trying not to scream, not to make a sound that would invite another insult. No one asked if she was okay. No one reached back to comfort her. It was as though she wasn't a woman about to give birth to a child, but rather an inconvenient obligation on their calendar. The car hit a bump, and she cried out involuntarily. "Can you be quiet?" Margaret snapped, twisting in her seat to glare at her. "You're not dying." Karen didn't even flinch. When they arrived, Karen parked the car without urgency. Shanae struggled to open the door, her breath shallow, her hands slippery with sweat. A nurse who had just stepped out to check another patient rushed over upon seeing her, pale and struggling. "Are you in labor?" she asked gently. Shanae nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from the pain, but from the overwhelming relief that someone, even a stranger, was finally asking her something with genuine concern. The nurse signaled for a wheelchair immediately, and within seconds, another staff member came rushing with one. "Breathe with me, all right?" "You're doing amazing," the nurse whispered as she helped Shanae sit down. She looked up briefly to see Karen and Margaret still standing near the car, not moving, not following, as if unsure whether they even wanted to come inside. Shanae's eyes blurred with tears, and yet she turned her head away quickly, too used to pretending she was fine. Inside the hospital, she was wheeled down white corridors, flooded with clinical light. The nurse's hand remained gently on her shoulder as they entered the maternity wing. "Do you have a birthing partner with you?" the nurse asked softly, and for a moment, Shanae didn't know what to say. A birthing partner. She nearly laughed. She had people who lived in her house, yes, people who were supposed to love her. But they weren't partners. They were strangers who lived in her shadow and dragged it across her back like chains. "No," she whispered finally, closing her eyes as another contraction ripped through her body. "No, I'm alone." The nurse nodded gently, clearly heartbroken by her answer, but she didn't press further. Instead, she focused on getting Shanae comfortable, checking her vitals, and prepping the labor room. Minutes passed like hours as the contractions became more intense, coming every few minutes, stronger, longer, more demanding. Her body shook, her breath caught, her hands clutched the sides of the bed as she fought to breathe through the pain. She asked if Karen was coming. The nurse checked the hallway, then returned and simply shook her head. "I don't think they're here, sweetheart." Shanae turned her face to the pillow and cried quietly, muffling the sobs so no one would hear her heart breaking in real time. She wasn't just afraid of the pain. She was afraid of bringing life into a world where she had none of her own. She was afraid her baby would be born into coldness, into absence, into the same silence that had swallowed her marriage whole. Hours passed. The pain was unrelenting, waves crashing against her every few minutes, giving her barely enough time to catch her breath before the next one stole it again. She gritted her teeth. She prayed. She screamed softly into her arm when no one was looking. The doctors and nurses came and went, checking her dilation, monitoring the baby's heart rate, offering soft encouragements. "You're strong," one whispered. "You're doing beautifully." But those words, as kind as they were, felt like fragile paper trying to cover a bleeding wound. She nodded, but her eyes remained on the door, hoping, even now, that maybe Karen would walk in and hold her hand. Maybe his mother would bring water or whisper something gentle for the sake of the child. But they never came. The room remained empty, except for her and the life she was trying to bring into this world with everything she had left. When the final stage of labor began, she screamed in agony, the pain like fire ripping through her bones. Sweat soaked her hair, her gown clung to her skin, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. A nurse squeezed her hand tightly and whispered, "You're almost there. Just one more push, Mama. You've got this." Shanae closed her eyes, channeled every ounce of strength, every ounce of grief, love, and defiance into that last push. And then the sound came, the cry of a newborn, raw, high, alive. A few seconds later, another cry, softer but strong. "You have twins," the nurse beamed. "Two beautiful little girls." But Shanae couldn't respond. Her body was numb, her mind flooded, her soul so exhausted it could barely register what had just happened. She wanted to smile. She wanted to cry with joy. But instead, all she felt was the crushing loneliness of realizing she had done it alone. She turned her head to the door one last time, hoping foolishly, desperately, that Karen would walk in and say, "I'm sorry. You're amazing." But it was not love that walked in. It was final betrayal. Karen stepped in, face unreadable, holding a small envelope. Behind him stood Margaret, arms crossed, face tight with disapproval. They didn't look at the babies. They didn't smile. Instead, Karen walked to her bedside, placed the envelope on her tray, and said coldly, "We're done. You're no longer a part of this family." Shanae blinked slowly, her lips parting. "What?" she whispered. Margaret added, "You've served your purpose, but this embarrassment ends here." And without another word, they turned and left. Shanae's world shattered in that moment, not from pain, but from abandonment that cut deeper than any knife. And she was left holding nothing but tears and silence, until one unexpected soul saw everything. The cries of her newborn daughters still echoed in the labor room, delicate and raw, the kind of sound that should have filled a mother's heart with overwhelming joy. But Shanae lay still, her body aching and drenched in exhaustion, her heart already split open by a kind of cruelty no woman should ever have to endure. She could barely lift her head. Her skin glistened with sweat, her breathing was shallow and broken, and every muscle in her body trembled from the battle she had just fought alone. The nurses had placed her babies in the infant cot nearby, swaddled in soft pink, their tiny fists curling and uncurling, completely unaware that the world they had entered had greeted their mother not with love, but with betrayal. The door to her room opened, not with joy, not with flowers, not with a gentle father walking in to meet his daughters, but with a heavy clicking sound of expensive shoes and a presence that turned the air cold. Karen stepped inside, wearing his usual pressed shirt and lifeless eyes, and behind him followed Margaret, poised and proud, like a general overseeing a war victory. They didn't look at the babies. They didn't ask how she was. There was no glance at the sweat on her forehead, no recognition of her trembling body that had just brought two human lives into the world. There was only silence at first, an eerie, suffocating silence, before Karen walked toward the tray beside her hospital bed and pulled an envelope from his coat. Shanae's gaze was barely able to follow him. Her limbs were heavy, her soul heavier. Her throat felt as if it had been rubbed raw from the scream she hadn't even been allowed to release freely. She tried to speak, but her lips only parted without sound. Karen placed the envelope down like it was a business memo, not the severing of a marriage. He looked down at her, expressionless, and said the words that stabbed deeper than any pain she'd felt during labor. "You're dead to us now." Each word struck her like a blade. Not, "We need to talk," not, "I'm sorry," not, "This isn't working," but a declaration of finality, as if she had never mattered, never existed, never been worthy of love. She blinked. Once, twice. Her ears rang, her chest rose, and fell in sharp, unsteady breaths, as if trying to catch air that no longer wanted to stay in her lungs. She turned her head weakly to look at him, disbelief coloring her face. But before she could even process the first wound, Margaret's voice sliced through the air like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "We never wanted you anyway." The venom in her voice wasn't hidden. It was laced with pride, with deep disgust, with the satisfaction of finally discarding what she had always considered unwanted. "You think giving birth to children makes you one of us? Please, you've always been nothing, just a stain on our name." Shanae's lips quivered as her eyes filled again, fresh tears pouring down her face as she tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. Her muscles were still weak, stitched, sore, her insides still healing, her heart torn to shreds. Her hands gripped the edge of the bed with what little strength she had, trying to anchor herself in a reality that had become far too cruel. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking like broken glass. "Why now?" "I gave you everything. I never asked for anything. I loved." But Karen didn't even look at her. He turned to adjust the cuff of his sleeve as if her cries were background noise. Margaret stepped forward instead, her eyes sharp, face twisted into something smug and merciless. "You were never one of us. Look at you, pathetic, crying, alone. You thought carrying our blood would make us love you? No, dear. It only reminded us how wrong this all was." The nurse on duty stepped into the room then, sensing the rising tension, but before she could say anything, Shanae raised her hand slightly. Not in protest, but in silent defeat. Her fingers trembled as she whispered, "Please, please, just go." She couldn't bear another word, another blow, another reminder that even after enduring 9 months of loneliness, even after suffering through hours of solitary labor, her worth still didn't exist in their eyes. Karen shrugged, turned toward the door without once glancing at the daughters he'd helped create, and Margaret followed, heels clicking sharply against the tile floor like punctuation marks on a death sentence. They didn't look back. They didn't ask the babies' names. They didn't say goodbye. As the door shut behind them, Shanae broke. She didn't scream, she didn't wail. She simply curled inward, holding herself as tightly as she could without tearing the fresh stitches beneath her gown, and let the tears flow in silence. Her soul had no more room for rage, only grief. Her hands reached out weakly toward the bassinet, where her twin daughters lay sleeping peacefully, untouched by the hatred that had just stormed through the room. She whispered, her voice barely audible, "You're not dead to me. I promise. You'll never feel the way I feel right now." The nurses came back in quietly, some whispering apologies they shouldn't have had to make. One of them brought her a glass of water, another helped wipe the sweat from her brow, but nothing could quench the fire of abandonment raging through her chest. Her body was wrecked, but her spirit felt more broken. She had carried life, nurtured it, protected it, and at her most vulnerable moment, the man who should have held her hand came to deliver the coldest betrayal a woman could endure. Divorce, disownment, erasure, all in the moment she was giving birth. And yet, through her shattered heart, a strange clarity began to form, the kind that comes when you've lost everything and realize you're still alive, that no one was coming to save her, that no apology would be made, that the people who had failed her had done so willingly, eagerly, and maybe, just maybe, this was where something new could begin, because the old had finally, violently, ended. She reached for her daughters again, this time able to sit up with the help of a nurse. The babies were so small, their heads covered in soft curls, their faces angelic in sleep. Shanae touched one little hand, and the fingers curled around hers instinctively. Her throat clenched, her heart squeezed. These two souls were the only good to come from a love that had never existed. "You are not mistakes," she whispered to them. "You are miracles." She wanted to promise them a better life, one far from coldness, far from the echo of rejection that had chased her from the moment she married into that house. But how? Where would she go? Who would take in a broken woman with twins and no family? She didn't know. But what she did know, what pulsed in her veins more fiercely than pain, was that she would never be like them. She would never let her children feel unloved. Her babies would grow up knowing warmth, even if she had to build it with her bare hands. The betrayal still sat like poison in her gut. The words, "You're dead to us," replayed in her ears like a curse, but they didn't kill her. Not completely. They had walked out thinking they'd buried her. But Shanae, despite her wounds, was still breathing, still alive, still a mother. And in that there was power. Somewhere down the hall, life continued. Babies cried, monitors beeped, nurses whispered. But in Shanae's room, something sacred unfolded. Not rage, not revenge, but resilience. A mother left for dead in her darkest hour, choosing to rise with nothing but love in her heart and her daughters in her arms. Outside the hospital room where Shanae lay, curled around her twin daughters, a man stood silently in the shadow of a half-open door. His name was Dr. Muller, a name that carried weight in both medical circles and the business world. He was more than just a doctor. He was a CEO, a medical visionary, a man whose hospital bore his name and whose wealth could fill cities with gold. And yet, at that moment, he was just a man, frozen, breath held, heart thudding as he watched something far more powerful than medicine unfold. He had seen births before, screams, emergencies, life and death, but never had he seen pain like this. Pure, quiet, human devastation masked behind brave, motherly eyes. He hadn't intended to stop. He was between rounds, reviewing notes, dressed in his tailored white coat over a charcoal vest and fine linen shirt, his stethoscope hanging unused around his neck. But as he walked past room 414, something halted him. Not the sound of babies crying, but the silence that came after. The kind of silence that echoes in the soul. He looked through the thin strip of glass and saw her, Shanae, fragile yet composed, body broken but spirit barely holding on. Her tear-streaked face wasn't just exhausted, it was devastated in a way that few ever understood. Beside her lay two newborn girls, beautiful and soft, untouched by the storm their mother had just weathered alone. He saw the tray table still holding a white envelope. He didn't need to read it. He knew what it meant. He'd overheard the last few sharp words as he passed earlier. "You're dead to us." He had turned to leave, out of respect, out of professionalism. But his legs wouldn't carry him. His feet remained planted, rooted like a man watching a life-altering moment, unable to walk away. And when Margaret stormed out, pride wrapped in cruelty, and Karen followed behind her like a ghost of a man, Dr. Muller's gaze drifted back to Shanae, whose sobs had stopped not because the pain was over, but because she had nothing left to cry. He opened the door, slowly, carefully, not wanting to startle her. The lights inside were dimmed now. A nurse stood at the far end of the room, folding blankets. Shanae was sitting up slightly, her arms curled protectively around her babies, one on each side. She looked like a painting, half goddess, half broken angel. Her eyes were half closed, her lashes wet, her lips parted as she murmured gentle words to her daughters that he couldn't quite hear. But he didn't need to hear them. He could feel them. They were words stitched from pain and motherly love, soaked in heartbreak but soft as lullabies. He stood at the threshold for a second longer, and then he spoke, his voice soft but certain. "Excuse me, may I come in?" Shanae looked up slowly, startled, her body still on edge from betrayal. But when her eyes met his, something inside her stilled. He wasn't like the others. There was no sharpness in his tone, no judgment in his stare. Just warmth, a rare, unexplainable kind of warmth. "I'm Dr. Muller," he said gently, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. I was just passing by. I saw everything. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The way he said it made her heart twist, because he wasn't pitying her. He was witnessing her. She nodded slowly, unsure if she could speak without breaking again. He moved closer, standing beside the bassinet. The babies were sleeping now, soft breaths rising and falling in perfect rhythm. He looked down at them, then back at her. "They're beautiful," he said quietly, "just like their mother." Shanae blinked hard, turning her face slightly to the side, trying to hide the way her lips trembled. Compliments weren't things she heard often, not ones that didn't have hidden insults attached. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I'm not used to people being kind." He crouched slightly so they could meet eye to eye. "That's not your fault. That's theirs." Something about the way he said it made a crack in her chest widen, but not in a way that hurt. In a way that felt like air finally reaching a place that had been suffocating for too long. She looked at him more closely now. He was handsome, but not in the arrogant, polished way of her ex-husband. His features were kind, his beard trimmed with purpose, his eyes a rare shade of gray that looked silver in the dim hospital light. But it was the emotion in those eyes that made her breath catch. He wasn't just observing her. He was feeling something. Deeply. Dr. Mueller reached out and gently adjusted the blanket that had slipped from one of the baby's tiny shoulders. His hands were steady, practiced, but tender. "They're strong. I can see it in their heartbeat. But their mother, she's stronger." Shanae let out a soft laugh through her tears, the sound bittersweet. "I don't feel strong," she said. "I feel broken." He nodded, understanding more in those few words than most people would in 1,000. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who break, but still hold someone else together. His hand hovered gently over the edge of her bed. "I want to help you." She blinked again, unsure of what he meant. Help her how? Why? What did a man like him see in a woman like her, a discarded wife with newborn twins, no home, no family, no future? But before she could ask, he leaned in just slightly, voice lower now, almost a whisper meant for her alone. "You don't deserve what happened to you, not any of it. And I can't unsee what I saw today. A woman gave birth in pain, in isolation, with no love beside her, and still had the grace to hold her babies with kindness." His eyes searched hers, steady. "I've never seen anything more powerful in my life." Shanae's throat tightened, her hands now clutching her blanket like a shield. "Why are you saying this?" she asked. "What could you possibly want from me?" Her voice shook, not from anger but from disbelief. Because men always wanted something. Love was never freely given. But Dr. Mueller didn't look away. "I want to marry you," he said softly, "not out of pity, not out of charity, but because I see you, and I've never wanted anything more than to offer you the life you should have had all along." The words hung in the air like magic. Shanae stared at him, lips parted in disbelief, her heart suddenly thudding not from pain but from confusion, from shock. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "You don't know my past, my scars, my shame." He reached forward then and gently took her hand, just one. His grip was warm and firm. "I don't need to know your past to know your worth. I saw it in the way you held your daughters after they left you bleeding. I saw it in your silence, in your pain. And if you'll let me, I want to be the one who shows you how it feels to be cherished." Shanae's tears fell again, but this time they weren't just from grief. They were from the sudden warmth seeping into places that had been cold for years. She looked down at her daughters, then back up at the man before her. His offer was impossible, wild, a dream she'd never dared to dream, but in his eyes she saw no deceit, only a strange kind of safety, a peace she hadn't known existed. "Why me?" she asked again, her voice almost childlike. He smiled, the kind of smile that felt like sunrise. Because you're everything they were too blind to see, and because I've been waiting for someone like you my whole life. And in that moment, the shattered pieces of her soul paused, caught between disbelief and the beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. Shanae sat frozen in the hospital bed, the rhythm of her heart shifting into something unfamiliar. Not fear, not pain, but a strange softness that wrapped around her soul, like dawn creeping into a long, cold night, and her eyes, tired and swollen from the storm she had endured, held onto Muller's face as if trying to determine whether he was a man or a vision stitched together by exhaustion and wishful dreams. Because after all she had faced, she had forgotten what kindness looked like without cruelty attached to it. And this man, this handsome doctor with soulful gray eyes and a voice that didn't pierce but soothed, was offering her something she hadn't even dared to hope for. Not pity, not rescue, but love. And real love, too. The kind she had read about in books and dreamed of when she was younger. Before her skin had been mocked, before her love had been ignored, before her motherhood had been thrown aside like an unwanted page in someone else's story. Dr. Mueller hadn't touched her like she was fragile, hadn't spoken to her like she was less. He had held her baby like he was already their father, looked at her like she wasn't broken but incredibly brave. And when he repeated those words, those impossible, beautiful words, "Let me love you, let me give you the life they stole from you," her breath caught not from disbelief alone, but from the aching, gnawing need to believe that maybe, just maybe, life was offering her a second beginning. Her lips parted to speak, but no sound came at first, only a trembling breath as she looked down at her daughters, their tiny hands curled against their soft blankets, their cheeks flushed with life, unaware that their arrival had not only rewritten her world, but somehow cracked open the heart of a man she had just met. Shanae's voice finally returned in a whisper, one barely audible. "Why?" And her question hung in the air, raw and simple. "Why would you want me?" And she wasn't asking out of low self-worth alone, but from years of being told she was too much, too dark, too wrong, too invisible, and Dr. Mueller didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Instead, he stepped closer, eyes locked on hers, and in a voice both gentle and firm, he answered, "Because the world failed you, but I won't." And something in her shattered. Not in pain, but like ice melting after a long winter, like walls she didn't know she still had, crumbling under the weight of his sincerity. And when he reached out, slow and respectful, to take the hand she wasn't even aware was shaking, she didn't pull back, didn't recoil, just stared at his warm fingers lacing with hers, grounding her in a moment so unreal she had to blink twice to make sure she hadn't drifted into sleep. Her heart didn't know what to do with kindness like this, her mind unsure how to translate safety when it wasn't a trap, and yet her body, still tender, still sore, relaxed slightly for the first time in hours, because somehow his presence calmed her more than any medicine could. And when he turned toward the nurse nearby and asked softly if she was discharged yet, the nurse blinked and smiled, nodding gently, saying, "Yes, just signed off a few minutes ago." And Dr. Mueller looked back at Shanae with a calm assurance, saying, "If you'll let me, I'll take you home, to my home." And the very idea of having a home that didn't smell like judgment, that didn't echo with insults, that didn't feel like prison, made her eyes sting again, this time from the tenderness she hadn't felt in so long. Still, part of her hesitated, because trauma doesn't vanish in a moment, and love doesn't undo wounds overnight. And yet, when he gently picked up her daughters, one in each arm, his grip steady and natural, like they had always belonged there, like fatherhood had found him through fate, not blood. Her chest rose and fell with a quiet gasp, and that old voice inside, the one that always told her to brace for hurt, was silenced for a moment, replaced by a voice that whispered, maybe this time is different. Dr. Mueller didn't push her, didn't rush. He waited patiently while she watched him cradle the life she had built, in loneliness now wrapped in love, and with hands that still trembled, she shifted to sit on the edge of the bed, her body aching but her will strong, and she whispered, "Okay." Not loudly, not boldly, but with a softness that carried years of weight, and Dr. Mueller didn't smile like a man who had won something, but like a man who had just found what his life had been missing all along. The hospital staff brought her a fresh gown, helped her change, brought a warm blanket to wrap around her. And when it was time to leave, Dr. Mueller carried the car seats himself, careful not to jostle the babies, his luxury SUV waiting outside, spotless and spacious, unlike anything Shanae had ever ridden in before. And as he opened the door for her and helped her into the back seat, she realized that not once had he looked at her body with anything but respect. Not judgment, not desire, not curiosity, just simple, reverent care. And when he slid into the driver's seat and glanced at her through the rearview mirror, their eyes met again, and she saw something she had never seen in a man before. Not dominance, not control, but promise. And not the kind whispered by liars, but the kind backed by every quiet gesture he had made. The drive to his home was quiet but peaceful, the car moving smoothly through city streets, bathed in sunset light, and with every passing minute, Shanae felt more of the old weight loosen from her chest, like the chains of the past were slowly unlocking, and by the time they reached the iron gates of his mansion, tall, elegant, surrounded by trimmed gardens and glowing lamps, her breath hitched again, because she had never imagined a place like this would open its doors for her. The mansion was beautiful, but it wasn't the luxury that moved her. It was the silence, the peace, the absence of cruelty. And when he carried her daughters inside, not letting the staff touch them but doing it himself, she saw in him something sacred, a man who didn't see her as damaged goods, but as someone sacred, someone deserving. And when they entered the grand foyer with its soft chandeliers and warm polished floors, he said softly, "This is your home now. Everything here is yours." And her knees nearly gave out, not from pain, but from the overwhelming kindness wrapped in his every word. He didn't lead her to a cold guest room, but to the master suite, his room, and told her gently, "You will rest here, not because you're weak, but because you deserve rest." And he placed the twin bassinets beside the bed, arranging every detail with care, from the temperature of the room to the scent of the linens. And when she finally sat on the soft bed, her back against the pillows, he sat beside her, not close enough to invade, but close enough to be present, and asked softly, "Would you like me to stay?" And she nodded just once, needing more than words could say to not be alone anymore. That night, for the first time in what felt like centuries, Shanae closed her eyes not in fear, but in safety, her babies breathing softly beside her, and a man who had no reason to love her yet already did sitting in silence, watching over her like a promise come to life. And as she drifted into sleep, she didn't think about the insults, the betrayal, or the pain. Instead, she whispered one small prayer of thanks to whatever power had placed Dr. Mueller outside that room on the day she thought her life was over. Because somehow, in the ashes of what was meant to destroy her, a new chapter had begun, one written not in scars, but in slow, healing hope. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the long ivory curtains of the master suite, brushing over the pale cream walls and the rose-colored cradle where Shanae's twin daughters slept, their tiny chests rising in perfect rhythm with the peace that had settled over the room like a healing breeze. And as Shanae stirred gently beneath the silk sheets, her lashes fluttering open to a world she still hadn't learned to fully believe was hers, she was met not with silence or shadows, but the quiet clinking of a breakfast tray and the tender hum of a man whose presence had slowly begun to feel like safety in human form. Dr. Mueller, hair slightly tousled from sleep, eyes warm with early affection, stood beside the antique oak table arranging her favorite things: warm croissants, berries with cream, fresh orange juice, and a tiny vase with a single lily, just like the one he had noticed her admiring in the garden 2 days ago. And when she sat up, her arms reaching instinctively for her girls, he smiled and walked over, pressing a kiss first to each baby's forehead, and then, without hesitation, bringing the tray to her lap like she was royalty, and saying in his velvet morning voice, "Good morning, my queen." Those words, soft as they were, sank into her the way warmth seeps into skin after a lifetime of cold, and her lips quivered, not with doubt this time, but with that unfamiliar ache of being cherished without question, of being seen not as someone surviving, but someone worthy of celebration. He sat beside her, elbows resting gently on his knees, watching her take a bite with a kind of admiration she wasn't used to, and when she offered him half of her croissant, he laughed gently and took it, their fingers brushing, eyes locking, and suddenly her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the strange wonder of realizing this man, who had every reason to stay distant, had chosen instead to draw closer with each passing day, not through grand declarations, but quiet, everyday tenderness. He helped with the babies, not as a guest, but like a father who had memorized their cues, who knew how to warm their bottles just right, who rocked them to sleep without complaint, who held them close to his chest like they were extensions of his own heart. And Shanae, from the corner of her eyes, watched him every time, trying to stitch together how someone who had entered her life like a whisper was now the rhythm in her every breath. He never asked for anything, not her touch, not her trust, not her love. He simply gave, every hour, every gesture, and it was in those moments, when he handed her a cup of tea while she rocked the babies, when he complimented the curve of her smile after a nap, when he placed his hand gently on the small of her back as they walked through the garden, that something inside her began to soften, not out of obligation, but because love, real, undemanding, patient love, had begun to take root in the quiet corners of her heart where she had once buried all hope. He gave her space but never left her alone, gave her dresses wrapped in pastel tissue paper that complemented her skin in ways she had never imagined possible, told her every morning, "You're beautiful," with a sincerity that never once sounded rehearsed, and one evening, while she stood near the window holding one of her daughters, as the orange light of dusk bathed her features in a glow so radiant she didn't recognize herself, he walked behind her and whispered, "I don't know what kind of angels crafted you, but they must have carved you out of strength and sunlight." And her breath caught, her fingers tightening around the baby, as the words struck a place too sacred to speak aloud. Each passing day became a thread in a new tapestry, one woven not of pain but of healing, laughter, shared breakfasts, warm fires, soft pajamas, and silent moments filled with the music of two people learning how to exist beside each other with no expectations except honesty. One afternoon, as rain whispered against the windows and her daughters lay napping in their twin bassinets by the fireplace, Shanae sat curled in a plush chair wearing a soft pink robe, her hair loosely braided, her face fresh and serene. And Dr. Mueller came in with a book in hand and a strange stillness in his movements. He didn't speak immediately, just set the book down, knelt before her like a man not asking for permission, but offering reverence, and took her hands in his, thumbs brushing over the soft lines of her palms, and when she looked into his eyes, those deep silver pools that always held more truth than words, he said, quietly but with fire, "You are not someone I rescued. You are the one who rescued me." And the world around her paused, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath, because for the first time in her life, a man wasn't praising her out of need, wasn't placing love like a crown above her head. He'd take away the moment she disappointed him. This was real. This was rooted. This was devotion. and her lips parted with a tremble as tears rose unbidden, spilling not from pain but from the overwhelming ache of joy, and as he kissed the back of her hand, lingering like a prayer. She said nothing at first, just stared at the man who had given her back her own name, her own dignity, her own heart. Slowly, her fingers closed around his, not out of fear, but from something new, hope. And with her heart fluttering, she whispered, "I've never held anyone's hand and felt safe before." And he looked up, smiling with a quiet intensity, saying, "Then let me be the first and the last." And that evening, as candles flickered in the living room and the scent of vanilla lingered in the air, she let herself fall asleep in his arms on the couch. One twin nestled on his chest, the other in her arms, and there was no fear, no tension, only the quiet symphony of a family that had formed not through blood, but through grace. And so the stranger who had once stood silently in a hospital hallway became the man who now stood between her and every shadow from her past. And though she hadn't spoken the word love aloud yet, it lived in every glance, every breath, every shared silence between them. And in his home, a place she once feared would never truly be hers. She wasn't a guest, wasn't a charity case, wasn't someone tolerated. She was the woman who made him laugh, who softened his hardened solitude, who gave meaning to his silence. And when he kissed her forehead goodnight and whispered, "Sleep well, my queen," she believed it, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving. She was loved. The morning after she fell asleep in his arms, a new kind of silence settled in Dr. Muller's mansion. A silence not born of loneliness or shadows, but the peaceful hum of two hearts learning to beat beside each other without fear. And as the soft light of dawn crept across the pale walls of the master suite, Shanae stirred awake to the warmth of something she had once thought she'd never feel again. Belonging. Dr. Muller still sat beside her, one of the twins dozing gently on his chest, his hand resting protectively over her tiny back, and his head leaned back with a serenity that made her chest tighten, not with pain, but with something deeper, something soft and aching and beautiful. She watched him for a moment, her fingers lightly brushing over the blanket that covered their legs, and in that stillness, she realized she no longer felt like a guest in someone else's home, no longer like a woman passing through kindness she didn't think she deserved. Instead, she felt rooted, grounded, like her soul had finally found a place to rest. And when he opened his eyes and met hers with a sleepy smile, one that carried the tenderness of a man who never thought he'd be seen as anything more than a healer, but was now healing too. Through her presence, her breath caught in her throat and her heart whispered, "This is real." Over the next days that melted into weeks, Shanae began to bloom, not like flowers in spring that rise suddenly and burst into color, but like something sacred and slow, a kind of blooming that happens when a woman is finally safe, when she's not questioned, not controlled, not shamed, but seen, adored, and understood. Dr. Muller's love was not loud or performative. It was a quiet, unwavering current that touched everything in her world. He cooked breakfast with her and made her laugh with his terribly good impressions of baby babble. He danced with her in the kitchen barefoot while holding a spoon like a microphone, spinning her in his arms to the rhythm of a song playing only in their hearts, and every night without fail he kissed her forehead like it was a vow, a promise renewed again and again that she would never go to bed unloved. And slowly the walls she didn't even know she had built began to come down, not all at once, but in pieces, in moments. The first time she wore her natural hair proudly around the house, and he said it looked like a halo. The first time she put on one of the dresses he gifted her and saw herself not as someone hiding, but glowing. The first time she laughed so freely, her own voice surprised her, and the way he looked at her like that laughter was the rarest music he had ever heard. The twins, now cooing and growing brighter each day, wrapped their tiny hands around his fingers like they had always belonged to him, And the first time one of them babbled "Papa" while reaching for his face, Shanae's heart clenched with so much emotion she had to turn away and cover her mouth, not to hide grief, but to contain the flood of healing that had taken her by surprise. And Dr. Mueller, with his steady hands and quiet tears, kissed the baby's fingers and whispered, "That's right, I'm yours." Not to impress her, but because he already believed it was true. Every corner of the mansion began to change, not in structure, but in soul. The halls were no longer echoes of solitude, but alive with laughter, with the soft thuds of baby feet kicking against blankets, with Shanae's voice singing lullabies in the nursery, with the sounds of two people who weren't falling in love. They were choosing love, building it every day, every hour, brick by emotional brick. And one afternoon, as Shanae stepped out of the walk-in closet wearing a soft cocoa-colored dress that hugged her figure just right, Dr. Mueller looked up from the couch and stared, not with hunger but with reverence, and then rose silently, walked to her, and lifted a framed photo off the mantel. It was one of her laughing, holding the twins in the garden, her head tilted back under sunlight, a joy captured in motion. And beside that photo, he placed it carefully next to a picture of his late mother, who had been the last woman to ever call this mansion home. Shania watched in quiet awe as he turned to her and said, "You're my family now." And something in her shattered in the most beautiful way, because she knew in that instant that this wasn't a man filling a void. This was a man who had found his missing piece, and so had she. That night, as thunder rolled across the sky and rain kissed the windows, Shanae sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance as the twins slept peacefully, their breath a lullaby in the background. And Dr. Mueller walked over with a blanket and draped it over her shoulders, then sat beside her, their knees touching, their silence comfortable. And when she looked at him, really looked at him, with all the fear she had once known, now softened by the way he had loved her without ever asking her to become someone else, she leaned forward and kissed his cheek, slow and gentle, and whispered, "Maybe. I'm ready." He didn't rush her, didn't pull her into a kiss or press for more. He simply turned his face slightly until their eyes met, and whispered back, "Then I will wait for the rest, for as long as you need." And they sat that way for a long time, wrapped in silence, the kind that only love can fill. And in that moment, as thunder echoed far in the distance and the fire warmed the room, Shanae realized something profound. Not only was she no longer afraid, but she no longer wore her past like armor. She walked through the halls of the mansion with her chin lifted, her brown skin glowing against satin and light, her voice clear and soft as she sang, her body once abused by stress, now gently embraced by love. And when she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a woman abandoned, no longer saw pain etched into her reflection. She saw a woman held, honored, rising. Healing did not happen all at once, but in moments like this, with arms wrapped around her waist at night, with lullabies sung not in desperation, but in joy, with a man who didn't fix her but gave her space to repair herself. She was healing. He was healing. And together they were rewriting what love looked like. 1 month after that thunder-soaked night where love whispered its first breath between two souls that had been starved of safety for too long, the days that followed felt like scenes from a dream painted gently over the scars of yesterday. And for Shanae, every morning began not with dread but with gratitude, waking beside Dr. Mueller, who always greeted her with a soft, "Good morning, my love," brushing his fingers along her cheek like it was his favorite ritual. And now, after countless breakfasts shared beneath the golden sunlight that spilled through tall windows, after story-time laughter with the girls echoing through the once quiet halls, after long walks hand in hand across the stone paths of his estate gardens where time seemed to stand still, Dr. Mueller knelt once again, but this time with a velvet box in his hand and a steady look in his eyes, saying not, "Let me love you like before," but "Let me give you my forever." And Shanae, her hand to her chest, heart pounding with emotions so large they felt like oceans inside her, nodded through tears, unable to form words as she whispered yes over and over again. Preparations were simple yet divine, not extravagant for the sake of show, but meaningful and crafted with soul. Dr. Mueller chose the venue himself, a garden he had once planted, in memory of his late mother, now blooming in early spring with white roses, gentle lilacs, and cascading jasmine. And when Shanae walked into it the day before their wedding, she pressed her hands to her mouth and cried softly, overwhelmed by the purity of the space that seemed made just for them. The sun began to set on the evening of their vows, casting a warm blush across the sky, and beneath a canopy of twinkling fairy lights strung between willow trees, guests gathered in hushed reverence, not out of obligation but love. As soft music played and petals danced in the wind, and then, like a vision pulled straight from the pages of the fairy tale she never thought she'd live, Shanae appeared, wearing a soft golden dress that shimmered with each step she took, her skin glowing, her braids woven with delicate gold threads, her eyes shining with something far deeper than happiness. It was resurrection. Her twin daughters, no longer newborns but still tiny in their charm, waddled forward as flower girls, dressed in ivory tulle, tossing petals with curious giggles, and the crowd melted at the sight of them, while Dr. Mueller, standing at the altar in a white suit with a golden rose pinned to his lapel, forgot how to breathe when he saw Shanae walking toward him, his heart beating so loudly in his chest he thought it might echo into the sky. She walked with grace, with strength, her steps neither hurried nor shy, but steady, as though each one claimed back a piece of herself. And when she reached him, he took her hand like it was made for his, pressing a kiss to her knuckles before guiding her gently up, to stand beside him beneath the rose-covered archway. The officiant spoke, but the moment was theirs, a universe held in silence between their eyes, and when it came time for vows, Dr. Mueller didn't read from a paper. Instead, he took her hand in both of his and said, "Shanae, I promise to love the parts of you the world refused to see, to cherish the cracks, the scars, the fire, the softness, and the storm that lives in your soul. I vow to walk beside you, not in control, but in partnership, to lift you when you feel low, to celebrate you when you rise, and to never let you forget the miracle that you are." Shanae's tears fell freely, not out of pain but awe, and when it was her turn, she held his gaze and said through quivering lips, "You brought me back to life. You taught me what love is, not with words but with actions. You held me when I was afraid to be touched, looked at me when I felt invisible, and you gave my daughters the father they deserved. I vow to love you, not for what you give, but for who you are, and I promise forever and again." The crowd stood still, hearts full, and when they kissed under the lights, under the watchful eyes of roses and stars, and a moon that seemed to pause in its orbit, the world held its breath for them. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a baptism of two hearts reborn, and when he wrapped his arms around her, lifting her gently as she laughed and cried against his shoulder, it wasn't the fairy tale ending people often dream of. It was something far rarer, a beginning written in truth. That night, as the sky turned deeper and the guests disappeared, leaving them alone under the stars, Dr. Mueller carried Shanae across the threshold of their suite, not because tradition demanded it, but because he wanted her to feel honored in every moment. The room was lit with soft candles, the bed adorned with rose petals, but none of it mattered compared to the look in his eyes as he closed the door and turned to her. No lust, no urgency, only reverence. He stepped toward her slowly, reaching for the pins in her hair, removing each one gently as her long braids fell like waterfalls against her back, and then his hands slid to the zipper of her dress, pausing only to whisper, "Are you sure?" And she smiled with tears glistening in her lashes, nodding as she said, "I've never been more ready." He undressed her as though unveiling art, his fingers trembling with gratitude. And when she stood before him, bare and beautiful, he didn't just look. He beheld, taking in every curve, every mark, every inch of the woman he adored. And when he leaned in and kissed her, it wasn't hunger. It was home. Their wedding night was not rushed, not fueled by urgency or desire alone, but painted in strokes of devotion, his hands mapping her skin with the gentleness of a man tracing a love letter, his lips brushing over her body like he was memorizing a prayer. And she met him there, offering not just her body, but every piece of her soul, wrapped in trust, in openness, in the sacred bloom of healing passion. They made love like two hearts, rediscovering the language they were born to speak, like two pieces of a puzzle finally fitted into place. And when he whispered, "You're a goddess," between kisses on her shoulder and the curve of her waist, she believed him, because in his arms she wasn't the girl who had once been discarded or unloved. She was the woman reborn, adored, divine. Hours passed in warmth and intimacy, soft laughter between kisses, tears mingled with whispers, limbs entwined like vines growing toward light. And when they finally lay together beneath the silk sheets, her head on his chest, his fingers in her hair, the silence between them was thick with everything that didn't need to be spoken. She looked up, her hand resting over his heart, and whispered those three words not as a question, not as a risk, but as a truth she had carried for days. "I love you." And he, already smiling, kissed her forehead, pulled her closer, and said with a voice both tender and eternal, "Forever and again." The morning after their sacred wedding night, the world didn't feel different in the way stories usually say. It felt deeper, fuller, as if the air around them had become heavier with meaning and lighter with joy all at once. And as the golden light of dawn peeked through the lace curtains, Shanae woke to the feeling of warm arms around her waist, her head resting on Dr. Muller's bare chest, and his heartbeat playing a soft lullaby against her ear, steady and calm like a song written just for her. Her first thought wasn't of pain or what-ifs or haunted memories. It was of peace, of the tender weight of love draped over her like the silk sheets beneath them. And as she blinked slowly, adjusting to the soft morning glow, she felt his hand reach up to tuck one of her curls behind her ear and whisper, "Good morning, my wife," in a voice laced with awe, and she couldn't help but smile, pressing a kiss to his chest as she whispered back, "Good morning, my forever." Their life together unfolded not in grand chapters, but in quiet pages of laughter and healing. They didn't need castles or crowds. Their mansion became a sanctuary not because of its size, but because of what filled it now. The melody of twin giggles echoing down the halls, the scent of cinnamon pancakes drifting from the kitchen where Shanae danced barefoot in one of Dr. Muller's oversized t-shirts. Flour smudged across her cheek, while her husband snuck up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist and kiss the spot between her shoulder blades that made her giggle like a girl discovering love for the first time. They painted the twins' room together, choosing a soft blush pink with Cloud's hand stenciled by Dr. Mueller himself, his once surgeon's steady hands now covered in pastel paint as he laughed with Shanae about how badly he was at art, but still managed to make the room feel like a fairy tale. He helped with feedings, never once treating it like a chore, cradling their daughters in his arms as if they were made of stars, whispering stories about moonlight adventures and teddy bear kingdoms, kissing their tiny foreheads before tucking them into their cribs with hands that had once held scalpels but now held life in its softest, most fragile form. On weekends, they created traditions that didn't need perfection, picnics under the backyard tree with mismatched blankets, juice boxes, and sticky kisses, family hugs that became tickle fights, sunrise cuddles on the living room couch with babies sprawled across their laps and Shanae resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the sky blush awake. In that home, love wasn't something spoken once and forgotten. It was reaffirmed in every act, in every glance, in every sigh of relief that whispered, "We made it." Shania no longer walked with hesitation. She floated, moving through the house like a woman whose skin was kissed by the sunlight, her brown, smooth glow worn like a crown rather than something to be hidden. And when she laughed now, it wasn't a sound laced with apology. It was free, bold, full of life. She started cooking again, not out of duty but out of joy, mixing old family recipes with new ones she learned from Dr. Mueller's childhood memories, adding flavors of love into each bite as she fed not just her family's bellies but their hearts. And on the mantel above the fireplace, she placed a new family photo, one taken on a bright Sunday morning where the twins wore matching sunflower dresses. Dr. Mueller held them both, with his arms strong and full of pride, and Shanae stood between them, radiant, glowing, smiling a smile that came from a place no one could break anymore. It was the kind of photo that didn't need filters or explanations, just truth, just love, just a snapshot of what healing could look like when you're finally loved for every inch of who you are. No one in that house mocked her skin anymore, because there, her skin was celebrated, kissed, caressed, painted in soft lights and silk sheets, wrapped in warm baths and loving arms that adored every shade of her beauty. No one silenced her voice anymore, because there, her voice read bedtime stories, hummed lullabies, and moaned sweet nothings into the neck of a man who worshipped the sound of her soul. Her scars no longer defined her. Instead, they became stories she wore like art, reminders of the fire she survived and the light she stepped into. Dr. Mueller never forgot a single detail that mattered. He'd surprise her with a new bookmark when he saw her reading again, build shelves for her cookbooks, hang her old poetry on the wall like it belonged in a museum. And every night, before they fell asleep in each other's arms, he would take her hand and kiss it gently, whispering against her skin, "Thank you for marrying me," like a man who still couldn't believe he had been blessed enough to call her his. And Shanae, no longer afraid of being vulnerable, no longer bracing herself for cruelty, would smile with misty eyes and reply, "You saved me with love," not because she owed him her survival, but because his love had been the garden that allowed her own roots to grow. In that home full of light and laughter, every room had a story. The nursery smelled of baby lotion and lullabies. The kitchen carried echoes of dancing and midnight snacks. The bedroom held their secrets, their laughter, their whispered dreams. The living room bore witness to movie nights curled under blankets and giggles shared over popcorn. Even the quiet had changed, from something she once feared to something she now cherished. A silence that spoke of safety, of warmth, of love that didn't need noise to exist. There was no more walking on eggshells, just barefoot freedom, shared playlists, spontaneous kisses, and soft Sunday mornings filled with pancakes, cartoons, and sleepy-eyed love. They had created not just a home, but a sanctuary, where wounds were met with warm embraces, where joy was found in the mundane, where every "I love you" came wrapped in laughter or forehead kisses or holding hands during dinner. This was not a house. They had built a life, a real life. One where pain was acknowledged but not worshipped, where the past was respected but not repeated, where every breath, every heartbeat, every step was taken toward each other with no hesitation. And in the stillness of their nights when the babies slept and candles flickered against the walls, Shanae would lie with her head on Dr. Mueller's chest, listening to the rhythm of the man who had once been a stranger, now the melody of her world, and she would whisper, Thank yous not just to him, but to whatever grace had led her to that hospital on that cruel day. Because from heartbreak had come hope, and from rejection had come a love so profound, so complete, it made every shadow fade. Their home wasn't perfect, but it was full of love, and that was more than enough. The night was still, painted in soft blues and silvers, the moon casting a gentle glow through the nursery window, where stars blinked like quiet witnesses to a life once unimaginable. And Shani sat in the corner rocking chair, wrapped in her favorite shawl, the scent of lavender drifting from the twins' nightlight diffuser, and the sound of their gentle breathing filling the air with the most sacred music. She held a piece of parchment in her hand, smooth and cream-colored, and a pen that had inked both tears and triumphs, and with hands both strong and trembling, she began to write a letter, not to the world, not to her past, but to the future hearts of her daughters, to the souls she had once held beneath hers in that hospital bed where she was told she was dead, to the people who should have loved her most. "My darling girls," she began, her handwriting looping with quiet grace. "One day you'll hear a story about your mama being left alone, about pain so deep I thought I might drown in it, but also about the miracle that found me when I least expected it." Her hand paused as a tear dripped down her cheek, falling softly onto the paper, not as a mark of sorrow, but as a seal of gratitude. And she glanced up to the sight that always took her breath away. Dr. Mueller, kneeling on the plush carpet, gently braiding one daughter's hair with quiet concentration, while the other curled against his side, clutching her stuffed bunny as he read a bedtime story with all the voices and expressions that made their giggles fill the room like sunlight. In that moment, she didn't just see her husband. She saw everything she was once told she could never have. A partner who honored her, a father who cherished their children, a man who had stitched love into every broken seam she carried, and she knew with crystal clarity that the girl who once begged for crumbs of kindness was now dining at a table built from devotion. As the ink dried on her letter, her mind drifted, not to Karen, not to his cruel mother, not even to the dark moments that once defined her, but to the chain of grace that had led her here, to this room of warmth and bedtime stories, to a love so steady it had become the foundation of her every breath. She remembered that girl who once stood in the hospital, legs trembling, face streaked with tears, stomach torn in labor as papers of rejection were thrown at her like she was nothing. And she wanted to hold that girl now, tell her, "You're not nothing. You're the beginning of something glorious." That girl had cried herself to sleep, unsure if she'd survive. That girl had whispered apologies into the night, wondering why she wasn't enough. That girl had been ignored, mocked, shamed. But now, that girl had transformed. That girl now had a mansion filled with giggles, art on the walls made by tiny hands, rose petals still lingering on the floor from anniversary dinners, and a kitchen where she sang while he twirled her for no reason at all. That girl had a bedroom where passion wasn't performance. It was worship, where hands didn't hurt, but healed, where kisses didn't demand but delighted. That girl had morning cuddles beneath blankets that smelled of babies and warmth, had Sunday breakfasts where tiny fingers fed pancakes to their papa, and where laughter spilled so effortlessly it felt like a second language. That girl was now a queen. Her eyes welled with tears again, not from sadness but from the overwhelming beauty of knowing she had survived. She folded the letter with care, kissing the page gently before tucking it into a velvet box labeled "For When You're Ready," and placed it on the shelf above the twin storybooks, where one day they'd find it and know that their lives had begun not just in pain, but in extraordinary love. Dr. Mueller looked up then, catching her gaze with that look, the one that always reached straight into her spirit, and mouthed, "You okay?" And she nodded, whispering, "More than okay." When the girls were finally asleep, tucked in with lullabies and soft promises, Shania and Dr. Mueller stepped into the hallway and moved toward their bedroom, fingers laced, silence between them, not from absence but peace. And once inside, she turned to him, cupped his face, and said softly, "Do you know what you did for me?" He leaned into her touch, his beard brushing against her palm, and waited. "You gave me a life I never believed was mine to have," she whispered. "You didn't rescue me. You reminded me that I was never broken, just waiting to be seen." His eyes grew glassy, and he took both her hands, pressing them to his chest. "I didn't save you, Shanae. I just got lucky enough to love you." She smiled, leaning up to kiss his lips slowly, sweetly, like they had all the time in the world. And they did. That night they lay side by side beneath soft sheets, bodies wrapped like a poem written in skin and breath, and Shanae stared up at the ceiling, thinking about how full her life had become. No longer was she haunted by the voice that once told her she was too dark, too loud, too nothing. No longer did she cry herself to sleep, wondering if love would ever find her. No longer did she wake up bracing for insult, for cruelty, for coldness. Because now she was adored, cherished, completed. The mansion wasn't just bricks and wood. It was a sanctuary of second chances, a home built on trust, on laughter, on the kind of love that doesn't just whisper, "I love you," but proves it in 1,000 ways. Every night, Dr. Mueller still kissed her hand like it was the first time. Every night, she whispered back, "Thank you for choosing me." And he would reply, "You are everything." Shanae had become everything she was once told she could never be. And when the wind brushed against the windows and the stars blinked in rhythm with her heartbeat, she closed her eyes and let her final thought of the night wrap her in peace. Love had the final word.